The courthouse in the middle of that dust-blown frontier town was more than just a building of wood and stone. It was a stage where reputations were tried and fates were sealed. On that morning, the benches groaned under the weight of curious neighbors, ranch hands, and drifters, all eager to see one family's feud laid bare in the open. Whispers moved like restless wind. The rancher had stolen his own brother's land, carving fences where blood once tied them together. Some called him ruthless, others called him shrewd, but all knew the West had no mercy for men who blurred the line between kinship and betrayal. The accused sat tall, his face carved with years of sun and toil, yet his eyes betrayed the unease of a man cornered not by guns but by truth. His brother, broken by loss yet fierce with conviction, rose to testify, his words painting the picture of a theft that cut deeper than cattle or acres. It was the theft of trust, the kind of sin that haunted generations. The room held its breath, for there was nothing more bitter in the West than brothers turned to enemies. The judge, stern and unyielding, tapped his gavel, though even he could not hide the curiosity that flickered in his gaze. To him, it was not just about boundaries and deeds. It was about the unspoken law of the West, that a man's honor was worth more than the ground beneath his boots. If the accusations proved true, the rancher would not only lose the land, but his name, his standing, and the respect that made survival possible on such unforgiving soil. Yet just as the case seemed sealed, the air shifted. A murmur rippled through the crowd as a figure rose from the back of the room. A witness, unexpected, uninvited, but certain, stepped forward with a look that carried both dread and defiance. The rancher's eyes narrowed, the brother's breath caught, and the entire room leaned forward. For in that moment, everyone knew. This testimony held the power to turn shame into salvation, or to bury the accused beneath the weight of undeniable guilt. And as the witness began to speak, the truth, long hidden beneath layers of silence, loyalty, and fear, emerged into the open. What had begun as a tale of theft now promised to become something far more complex, a revelation that could either restore a family's fractured legacy or tear it apart forever. In the Old West, where land meant survival and blood meant loyalty, the line between justice and vengeance had never been so thin. The witness's boots echoed sharply against the wooden floor as he walked to the front of the room, every step louder than the last. The crowd shifted uneasily, men leaning forward on their benches, women clutching at their shawls. This was no drifter, no hired hand dragged into court by obligation. This was someone who carried himself with the weight of knowledge, as if the truth he bore had burned a hole straight through his soul. The rancher clenched his fists, his knuckles whitening, while his brother's eyes widened with both hope and fear. The man adjusted his hat and looked toward the judge, then toward the two brothers whose feud had divided not only blood but the town itself. His voice, when it came, was steady, but behind it lay years of silence now breaking loose. "I seen what happened," he began, his words slicing through the thick air. The crowd erupted in murmurs, but the judge slammed his gavel, silencing them at once. The story was about to unfold, and no one dared miss a word. The rancher's face, hardened by the sun and storms of the frontier, betrayed a flicker of unease. He had expected lies, exaggerations, maybe even anger from his brother. But this was different. The witness was neither kin nor enemy. He was a man of the land, a man whose word could not be dismissed easily in a place where reputation was as good as law. The rancher shifted in his chair, the weight of his brother's accusing stare pressing against him like a loaded rifle. The brother, once beaten down by grief, straightened with new fire in his eyes. He had begged the earth, the sky, and even God himself for proof, for something that would expose the betrayal he had suffered. Now, with every word spoken, that proof seemed closer. He looked at the witness not with doubt, but with desperate gratitude, clinging to the hope that justice had finally come to light. And yet, there was a strangeness in the witness's tone, a pause between sentences, as if each truth carried a shadow behind it. The courtroom listened, but beneath their anticipation was a growing sense that what he was about to reveal might be more dangerous than anyone expected. Not just theft, but a secret buried so deep it could tear apart not only one family, but the entire town. The witness leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he spoke. "The night the papers were signed," he said, "it wasn't the rancher who held the pen." A gasp ran through the room, sharp as the crack of a whip. The judge stiffened, the brother froze, and the accused rancher's face went pale beneath his weathered skin. The murmurs swelled again, a tide of disbelief and curiosity that filled every corner of the courthouse. He continued, each word deliberate, hammering into the silence. "I was there in the shadows. I saw the hand that wrote, and I heard the bargain made. Land was not stolen, it was traded. Not for money, not for cattle, but for a secret kept buried." His voice dropped lower, and the crowd leaned closer, the suspense tightening like a rope around every neck. The brother's breath caught, confusion flashing across his face. He had believed the theft to be simple, a betrayal of trust, a hunger for land. But the witness's words revealed something far darker, something that twisted the story into knots of lies and silence. He turned sharply to his sibling, searching his face for answers, but found only a mask of stone. The rancher's jaw worked, grinding against the weight of words that clawed at his reputation. He could deny it, call the witness a liar, but in the Old West, men knew truth when they heard it. It hung heavy in the air, undeniable, the kind of truth that didn't need proof on paper because it carried the fire of memory and the echo of lived betrayal. And as the silence thickened, the townsfolk felt it too. The story was no longer about a rancher who had stolen land. It was about a bargain forged in shadows, a choice made on a night few had known about, and the witness who had carried it in silence until the weight of it could no longer be borne. The trial was no longer about property. It was about a truth that would either free one brother or destroy them both. The courthouse grew still, every breath caught as though the walls themselves were listening. The witness fixed his gaze on the rancher, his tone sharper now. "It was not his hand that signed the deed," he declared. "It was mine, and I signed at his brother's bidding." Gasps rippled through the benches, hats tilted forward, eyes wide in disbelief. The brother's face went white, his mouth parting as though the ground had opened beneath him. The judge leaned forward, his gavel resting silent, but his authority filling the room. "Explain yourself," he demanded, his voice low but firm. The witness nodded slowly, his shoulders heavy with years of silence. "Your brother came to me," he said, gesturing toward the accuser. "He asked me to forge the papers. He promised me gold, promised me protection. And I did it, because in the West, survival sometimes demands sins no man should carry." The brother leapt to his feet, his voice breaking with fury. "Lies!" he roared, pointing a shaking hand at the rancher. "He stole from me, and now you twist the truth." But the crowd stirred uneasily, doubt creeping into their whispers. The lines of betrayal were no longer clear. The tale had shifted, and the villain was no longer so easily named. The rancher, still seated, turned slowly toward his sibling. His eyes were filled not with victory, but with a sorrow deeper than the desert night. "I did not steal from you," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the chaos. "I carried your shame." The words struck harder than any bullet, silencing even the judge. For in them lay a story no one had expected, a story of betrayal reversed, of sins hidden not for profit, but for blood. The widow in the back of the room clutched her shawl tighter, her breath trembling. She had buried her husband in this land, and she knew all too well that property was never just soil. It was the weight of legacy, the shadow of choices men try to bury, but which the desert always unearthed. The brother's rage trembled into disbelief, his face crumbling as he staggered back. "You're saying I gave it away?" His voice was a whisper now, fragile, stripped of its fire. The witness nodded once, solemn. "You traded it," he said. "Traded land for silence. You begged me to hide what you had done that night, something darker than theft. And I agreed. But when your brother carried the deed, he also carried your secret." The crowd murmured louder, like a storm gathering in the distance. Men looked at one another. Women pressed hands to their lips. The trial had become something else entirely, a revelation of sin layered deeper than soil, deeper than blood. Whatever had been buried was clawing its way back, and the truth threatened to crush both men under its weight. The judge's gavel struck hard against the wood. "What secret?" he demanded. His voice carried the authority of the law, but beneath it was the raw curiosity of a man who sensed the foundation of justice trembling. The brother looked around wildly, sweat pouring down his face, but his lips refused to move. The rancher lowered his head, his silence heavier than any denial. The witness, unable to bear the weight any longer, spoke with the voice of a man confessing his own sin. There was blood spilled that night, blood not meant to be spilled. The land was not payment, it was penance, a bargain struck to bury the dead and the truth together. His words fell like stones, each one heavier than the last, and the entire courthouse seemed to shiver beneath them. The brother collapsed into his seat, his body shaking as though the very earth had turned against him. The rancher remained still, his eyes fixed on the floorboards, and the crowd, once hungry for scandal, now sat in silence, realizing they were not witnessing a theft, but the unraveling of a tragedy carved deep into the veins of one family, and into the unforgiving soil of the West. The witness's voice cracked as he continued, his words hanging heavy like thunder before a storm. "A man was killed that night," he said, the courtroom gasping as if a single breath had been stolen from them all. "Not by outlaws, not by strangers, but here, by one of our own." His eyes flicked between the brothers, and the tension splintered the room in two. Men who had come for gossip now realized they were watching the unearthing of blood and guilt. The judge's face hardened, his gavel striking once, but even his authority could not calm the restless murmurs. The widow in the back clutched her shawl tighter, her heart racing as her mind filled with names, whose blood had been spilled, whose grave had been hidden beneath the soil they all walked on. The air was thick with dread, for secrets in the West never stayed buried forever. The accuser brother leapt to his feet, his face pale, but his eyes burning. "He lies," he shouted, pointing at the rancher with trembling fury. "He twists the truth to cover his theft." But his voice cracked with desperation, betraying fear more than conviction. The rancher sat still, his silence louder than his brother's rage, his eyes fixed on the floorboards, as if he could still see the stain of blood upon them. The crowd's whispers swirled like wildfire. Who had died? Was it murder for land, or something darker? Every soul in the room knew the truth of the Old West. Land was worth fighting for, worth killing for, worth dying for. And when family blood was involved, the stakes were higher than the law could ever measure. The witness stepped closer, his voice low, heavy with confession. "I buried him with my own hands," he said. "I buried the truth alongside him, because I was paid to keep silent. But silence rots a man from the inside, and today I give it back to the earth." The brother collapsed into his seat, his face hollow, his hands shaking as though the weight of every word had crushed the fight from him. The rancher finally lifted his head, his eyes meeting the witnesses with a sorrow deeper than any defense could offer. For a fleeting second, the mask fell, and the crowd saw not a thief, not a villain, but a man who had carried a burden too heavy for one soul to bear. The judge leaned forward, his voice rough. Whose blood was it? The question cracked the silence like a whip. All eyes turned to the witness, but his gaze shifted back to the brothers. "It was family blood," he said, his words breaking the air like a funeral bell. "A younger brother, caught in their quarrel, dead because of pride, buried because of shame." Gasps rippled across the room. Women pressed their hands to their mouths. Men shook their heads in disbelief. The feud they thought was about land was something far darker. It was about a grave dug too soon, a secret that had poisoned every acre of soil the brothers fought over. The West was merciless, but even it rarely saw a sin so heavy. The accusing brother buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. His cries were muffled but real, the sound of a man undone not by the lies of another, but by the truth of his own making. The rancher sat still, but tears lined the edges of his weathered face, his silence carrying the weight of everything he had endured to protect what was left of his family's name. And in that courthouse, where dust and justice mingled uneasily, the truth finally settled. This was not just a trial of land, but the reckoning of a family shattered by pride and silence. The hidden grave was no longer hidden, and the town would carry its memory like a scar burned deep into the desert itself. The courthouse was no longer a place of order, but of unease. The townsfolk shifted in their seats, whispering with voices sharp as blades. Some muttered that justice must be swift, that a life taken must be paid for in kind. Others stared at the brothers with pity, knowing that the land they fought for was now stained with the younger sibling's blood. The West had always been merciless, but this truth cut deeper than cattle theft or boundary disputes. It was a sin of family, and family sins are the hardest to forgive. The judge struck his gavel hard, demanding silence. His eyes swept over the room, but even he seemed shaken. In a land where justice often came from the barrel of a gun, it was rare to see men undone by truth alone. The widow in the back lowered her head, tears slipping quietly down her cheeks. She had lost her husband to the soil, and now she saw another family torn apart by it. The West took from everyone. It was only a matter of when, not if. The accusing brother lifted his face, streaked with tears and sweat. His voice cracked as he cried out, "I never meant for him to die." His words echoed against the wooden walls, desperate, raw. But in the silence that followed, no one answered. Regret was a poor currency in the West, and it bought no redemption once blood had been spilled. The rancher finally rose to his feet, his frame heavy with years of carrying the secret. His voice was low, but it carried to every ear in the room. "I bore the blame because I could bear it. You could not. I kept your sin, your silence, and your shame. But in the end, truth always finds its way out of the ground." His words rang like scripture, the kind men carried home in silence and repeated only at night when the fire was low. The crowd watched as the two brothers locked eyes, one broken by guilt, the other broken by the burden of hiding it. Neither could claim victory. Both had been defeated long before they stepped into the courthouse. And the land, the very soil they had fought for, now seemed cursed beneath their boots. The judge leaned back, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly as he set down the gavel. "This court cannot bury what the earth itself has already revealed," he said. His voice carried no triumph, only weariness. "Justice may take a form beyond these walls, but the truth has been spoken, and it will live longer than any verdict I can give." His words did not end the trial. They ended the illusion that justice could be neatly tied in parchment and ink. The witness stepped back, his eyes hollow, his confession leaving him drained. He had carried the weight of silence for too many years, and though his words had freed him, they had shackled the brothers forever. The crowd parted as he left, whispers chasing him like restless spirits. Some called him brave, others called him cursed, but none could deny he had changed the town that day. The accusing brother collapsed again, sobbing openly now, his pride stripped bare before the people who once respected him. The rancher looked down at him, his face unreadable. For years he had carried another man's sin as though it were his own, and though the truth was free, the cost had left scars too deep to heal. The court had seen him not as a thief, but as a man bound by sacrifice, and in the Old West, that was the kind of reputation that outlived even a grave. The townsfolk left the courthouse in silence, their boots crunching on the dusty street. They did not cheer, did not jeer. They carried with them the heavy knowledge that justice is never simple, and that sometimes the greatest crime is not in what a man does, but in what he hides. The West thrived on legends, but legends were born not from glory. They were born from tragedy. As the doors closed, the two brothers remained inside, alone with the ghost of their younger kin. The land they fought over was now a monument to him, a reminder that pride had buried more than cattle and gold. It had buried blood. And in the Old West, blood was the one thing the desert never forgot. The courthouse emptied until only the brothers remained, their silence echoing louder than any testimony. The rancher stood tall, though weariness bent his shoulders like an old oak in the wind. His brother sat hunched on the bench, broken, his sobs reduced to shallow breaths. Between them lay not only the memory of a younger sibling lost, but the years of hatred that had grown out of a single night of blood. The room smelled of dust, sweat, and gun oil, a reminder that justice in the West was never clean. The rancher finally spoke, his voice low, meant only for the man who once shared his blood. "We buried him together," he said, "and then I buried your shame with him. Every day I walked this land, I carried both yours and mine. I thought I was protecting you, but I see now All I did was keep the wound from healing. His words were not accusation, nor forgiveness. They were the simple truth of a man who had lived too long in silence. His brother lifted his head, eyes swollen and red. "Why didn't you let me face it?" he whispered. "Why didn't you let me carry what was mine?" The rancher looked at him, sorrow heavy in his gaze. "Because you were weak," he answered plainly. "And I thought love meant protecting weakness. But I was wrong. It only let the sin grow stronger." The brother bowed his head again, no reply left in him. The truth had been spoken, and there was no rewinding it. In the West, men often believed that silence preserved honor, but here, silence had been the greatest curse. Now both stood scarred, their souls branded by the memory of what had been buried and what had finally come to light. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. It sounded almost like a whisper, carrying with it the voices of the dead. For in the Old West, no secret stayed buried, no sin stayed hidden. The desert always remembered, and sooner or later, it demanded its due. By dusk, word had spread across the town like wildfire. In saloons, at ranch gates, by campfires under the open sky, men and women spoke of the trial, not as a story of theft, but as a tragedy of blood. Some called the rancher honorable for carrying his brother's sin. Others called him a fool for letting pride and silence ruin them both. But no one doubted that the tale would live long beyond the men who had lived it. The West thrived on such stories, where truth and legend tangled until neither could be undone. The brothers left the courthouse together, not side by side, but near enough that the town could see the shadow of their kinship still lingered. The accuser kept his eyes on the ground, his shame written in every step. The rancher kept his gaze on the horizon, where the dying sun bled red across the sky. Between them lay a bond that had been fractured beyond repair, yet tied forever by the grave of the brother who had fallen because of them both. The widow who had listened quietly all along watched them pass. She knew the land they fought for would never be the same. It was no longer property, no longer just soil to graze cattle on. It had become sacred and cursed at once, a monument to loss, pride, and the price of silence. She whispered a prayer, not for justice, but for peace, though she doubted peace could ever find men so scarred. The desert night fell quickly, stars spilling across the sky. The courthouse lights dimmed, and the town retreated to its quiet rhythm. But the story of that day was etched into every ear that had heard it. Fathers would tell it to sons, mothers to daughters, each adding their own weight to the tale, that the land was bought not with gold or cattle, but with the blood of a brother and the silence of two men too proud to face the truth. And so, the story of the stolen land became more than a trial. It became a warning. In the Old West, pride was often sharper than any blade, silence heavier than any bullet. And for those who lived by both, the end was always the same. The land might endure, but men would be buried beneath it, their sins carried forever on the desert wind. The courthouse may have closed its doors that night, but the echoes of what was spoken inside lingered far beyond its wooden walls. The story of two brothers and the grave they carried in silence became more than a family tragedy. It became a reminder of how pride and secrecy can bind a man tighter than any rope. In the Old West, land was measured in acres, but legacy was measured in truth, and the truth that surfaced that day weighed heavier than any fortune. The rancher's silence had once seemed like protection, a shield for his brother's weakness. But in the end, it was silence that poisoned them both. The trial revealed that even when one man carries another's shame, the earth itself does not forget. It holds the weight of every secret, every betrayal, and eventually, it forces them into the light. What was meant to be buried had risen, and in rising, it consumed everything they thought they were fighting for. The accuser left broken, the rancher scarred, and the town forever changed. They had all witnessed that justice is not always about punishment. It is about revelation. Sometimes the greatest sentence is not handed down by a judge, but by the memory of what has been done. And that is the cruelest law of the West. The desert remembers, the land remembers, and the truth never dies. Their story teaches that honor is not found in silence, nor in carrying another's sin, but in the courage to face the truth before it swallows you whole. Blood ties may bind us, But when pride replaces love, those ties can strangle instead of strengthen. In the unforgiving light of day, only truth has the power to heal or to haunt. The brothers learned too late that legacy is not about what you claim, but about what you choose to confess. If this tale struck you, let its lessons stay alive beyond this moment. Share your thoughts in the comments so your voice becomes part of the story carried forward. Subscribe to the channel to ride with us into more tales where the West reveals its harsh but timeless truths, and leave your like to help these legends travel further. After all, every story becomes greater when it is remembered, and it is your presence that ensures these voices are never lost to the wind.